Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. We've got a great topic today. I love it. Let's do it. Doctors and nurses of Reddit. What's your they shouldn't have survived story? Little not safe for work, but fascinating. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. During my internship in a local hospital, there were multiple stories about unlikely survival or outcomes, about people who, in my opinion, are immortal beings that like to spite God. Several cases have burned themselves into my brain, but there's one that takes the cake. A 31-year-old man was shot, then dropped at the local ER by the same guys who shot him. In total, he had 10 gunshot wounds across his thorax, abdomen, pelvis, and legs. The bullets went through almost every single organ and almost broke a femur and a tibia. Needless to say, he was in hypovolemic shock and needed emergency surgery and blood transfusions. Look, I cannot tell you how much care has gone into his case. He spent 3 months in the ICU, and he's now at the surgery floor of the hospital. So far, he's had 25 plus surgical interventions, and counting, from 3 different teams and over 50 bags of blood. At one point, one of the teams realized they couldn't completely close his abdomen after one particular surgery, and decided to leave his abdomen, and several surgeries later, he developed what we call hostile abdomen. The abdominal wall is scarred, and everything inside is topped up with fibrous adherences or tissues, to the point that going in for yet another surgery is a hellish experience. He's also had multiple infections, both nosocomial and from his own digestive tract. One bullet entered through the abdomen, pierced his rectum, and exited through one of his butt cheeks, and during the healing process, the wound became a fistula that continuously dripped pus and mucus riddled with bacteria in and out of the abdominal cavity, to the point he fell into septic shock twice. Regular antibiotics weren't doing the job no more, so infectology had to be called in regularly, as he needed and still needs one hell of an antibiotic cocktail. Although he's still not completely out of the woods, at least the surgeons were able to successfully close his abdomen. His infection is currently under control, and his legs are finally healing properly. If you ask me, he'll probably live, if the local gangs don't invade the hospital and kill him before he's discharged, because it almost happened with him a month into his stay. We had a guy come into the ER because he was feeling kind of dizzy and out of breath. They ordered a standard array of labs, and when we, the lab, drew his blood, we noticed that his blood seemed really thin and watery. That was because he had an effing 2.7 hemoglobin. For those of you who know hemoglobin values, I swear on my mother I'm telling the truth, that this man was both walking and conscious when he came in. He even argued about being admitted overnight. We couldn't even get his sample to run at first. We had to F with the sensors for it to register. For those of you who don't know hemoglobin values, it's basically measuring how much blood is in your blood, and therefore how much oxygen is capable of being carried throughout your body. Normal hemoglobin is roughly 12 to 16 or so, depending on age and gender. Below 10 is where they start considering the possibility of transfusion, and below 8 is considered critical. A 2.7 should be dead. Finally, my time to shine. Hematologist here. I deal with leukemias, lymphomas, unexplained anemia, that kind of stuff. My favorite story to tell is of a patient. Gonna call him Mr. X. Well, Mr. X is a 38-year-old patient who presented with swollen abdomen, extreme fatigue, peripheral edema, and multiple enlarged lymph nodes. To paint a mental image, imagine a huge purple potato with a toothpick for limbs and inflated gloves for hands. Wasn't looking human at all. After a lymph node biopsy, the diagnosis came: Hodgkin's lymphoma, HL. Now, HL is one of the few curable diseases if treated correctly. 6 to 8 rounds of chemotherapy. However, the subtype was rather aggressive and with poor prognosis, so his chances were grim to say the least. One course of chemo is about a month, but seeing his status not improving after 2 weeks, half a round of chemo, he wanted to be discharged to die in his bed in his home. So he calls his friend to pick him up, and off they go. 1 month later, a healthy-looking man, fit, groomed, approaches me and tells me he'd like to continue the chemotherapy because he's feeling great. I had no idea who I was talking to until he introduced himself as Mr. X. My jaw dropped to the floor and I sort of rushed to schedule his next rounds of chemo. I asked him what changed his mind about staying, and he tells me that on the way home, after about an hour on the road, he got a weird appetite. So he asked his friend to pick up about a dozen cans of Spam, the European equivalent at least, and he just devoured them on the way home. Seeing that, his friend told him when they got home, "Well, X, if you can cram that shit in your stomach, I'm pretty sure you can take at least 2 more rounds of chemo." So there he was, the living proof that Spam changes lives. So at the end of the chemo, 8 rounds, he had what we call a complete response, CR. A CR that lasts to this day, 5 years later, pretty much equivalent to cured in his case. No idea why I feel proud about his accomplishment, but it's one of my favorite stories to tell. TLDR. Guy gets cancer. Guy gets a little chemo, then rushes home, eats Spam, gets healthy, and resumes his chemo eventually to get cured. Okay, great story, and whatever it takes to help someone see the light, fantastic. But real question, assuming you're not from Hawaii, what's your take on Spam? Like it, love it, weird? I know it's a big part of Hawaiian culture, but what do you think? Not a doctor or nurse, but my dad. In May of 2019, he got hit by a train on his bicycle. The police report said it was going 80 miles per hour. When we got to the hospital on the first day, the doctors basically told us to prepare for his death. His blood pressure was dropping like crazy, but they cut a hole in his stomach and that seemed to stabilize things for the first night. He woke up a few weeks later and had broken all the ribs on the right, some on the left, both collarbones, his right arm, collapsed both lungs, and had a traumatic brain injury. After he woke up in the ICU, he was acting pretty crazy. The doctors told us he would never return to his job or regain the level of intelligence he had pre-accident. Eventually, he left the ICU, went to general ward, and then 2 rehabs. He left the second rehab early. By August 2019, went back to his job as VP. His speech was still slightly impaired at this time. In December 2019, he bought a new bike. As of today, he seems completely normal. Long shot, but if you were one of the first responders for this accident, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Whatever you did on that first day probably ensured that he got to live. Also, not a nurse or doctor, but a couple of months ago I had a serious skydiving accident in which neither my primary or reserve parachute opened properly. The reserve wasn't even open halfway. Ended up with a shattered femur, open book pelvis, burst fracture on the back, and some broken ribs. I will not be skydiving again, but I will be able to walk. My wife is a flight nurse, and her fellow coworkers saved my life on the helicopter. I was a phlebotomist during COVID. I watched 6-ish people die in one single weekend in my ICU mornings. I was friendly with some. There was one guy left. I can still see his face. For 2 months, I drew his blood, and his wife, non-ICU COVID, for a month. I watched him get intubated, extubated, and re-intubated. I remember telling his wife whatever I could that wouldn't upset her. On his blood pressure was almost normal today. Oh, his blood was so easy to draw today. The blood thinners seemed to be helping lately. Just not a lie, but not affirmation. I'd talk to him while he was out and tell him about his wife, how nice and wonderful she was, and how he had to keep going because she really missed him. Everyone thought he would die like the rest. He coded twice, at least during my shift, and he was only extubated for a few days because he was just really struggling. One day I come in after a weekend off, and he's not there. I panicked and was told he was moved to the first floor, which was on my way for morning routine. I never had a quicker, more efficient day at work. I was determined to be the one to get to his room. He was sat up in bed chatting with me after 2 weeks. I told him about his wife and anything he asked, and I was legally allowed to tell him. He walked out of the hospital on his own. I have some similar stories from COVID, but we all were like, holy shit, I can't believe he effing lived. Neither a nurse nor a doctor, but an EMTB working for a county 911 system. I was a crew of 2. Both of us were EMTBs. We received a call for a 40-something male having difficulty breathing and some chest pain. Once we arrived on scene and walked into the door to his kitchen, he was sitting in a tripod position at the kitchen table about 15 feet from us. He was audibly wheezing and said it was really hard for him to breathe, assisted him onto the stretcher and into the ambulance. Gave the patient O2 and placed him on a 12-lead BP cuff and pulse OX. Transmitted it to the nearby hospital and radio dispatch to try and have a paramedic unit meet me en route. Wasn't able to, so we made it to the hospital in about 5 to 10 minutes. When we transferred him from our stretcher to the hospital bed, he went into cardiac arrest. After the first round of CPR and cardiac drugs, They were able to sustain a pulse. After a few hours of running other calls, we were at the same hospital, and the doctor said that the patient had a pulmonary embolism, widowmaker, STEMI, and stroke, on top of him coding. As far as I know, he survived. Guy came in with foot-long scalp lac, several abdominal punctures, and an 8-inch knife sticking halfway out of his sternum, still talking to EMTs during the report. He was worked up, stapled up, discharged the night after they picked up his brother for doing it. No punctures to any organs, no cardiopulmonary injuries, no intestinal perforation. I don't know how. I sent him to the OR. I was able to even consent the guy, which was surreal as I was on-call trauma resident. An hour later, they said it was the right call, but they just did conscious sedation and pulled it out with anesthesia, and surgeons gowned and ready to intervene, and he was good for discharge as his police chaperone said it was safe. First-time poster, bear with me if my storytelling isn't the best. Wound care director, nurse, specializing in wounds for 6 years now. 2 wild wound stories patients shouldn't have survived. Patient A was a regular lady, little overweight, some mild hypertension, nothing crazy. A smart woman, worked a full-time job, aviation mechanic, comes into my work with NF, necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating bacteria, deadly gnarly shit. She had a 10% chance of survival. Her peritoneum was exposed completely. It had eaten her skin and soft tissue across her abdomen, all the way across top to bottom, around her flanks, the tops of her thighs, top of her vagina, under her breasts. The wound measured around 70 centimeters by 120 centimeters with a depth of 7 centimeters or so in some parts. After many months of wound care, skin grafts, and PTOT, she walked right out of the facility, scarred but completely fine. All of it started by a bug bite or a cut on her stomach after swimming in one of the local lakes in our state. Patient B was a patient suffering from severe mental illness. Her and her mother also had mental illness issues, were living in a motel. One day, patient B got up and decided she just wasn't going to walk anymore. She sat in the motel chair for roughly 45 days straight, urinating, defecating, not showering, etc. in this chair, literally lived and sat in the same spot. Eventually, motel staff received complaints of foul smells. They called the fire department. Her flesh had rotted off. Pressure injury that went necrotic and was eaten away by maggots in that chair. When they lifted her off, her skin had literally liquefied into that chair. Ugh. For obvious reasons, patient B and her mom became APS cases, and they actually became some of my favorite patients for many years. By the time patient B got to me, she had had multiple debridement surgeries, and she was left with a permanent colostomy and urostomy. Her wound was 20 to 25 centimeters deep approximately. She was obese. Imagine large butt cheeks just gone down to the bone. I could put my arm halfway up my forearm in her wound and move them side to side. It was easily 60 centimeters wide by 40 centimeters in length, sacral bone exposed bilaterally, with the bottom 3 to 4 vertebrae exposed too. Wow. Both butt cheeks were gone. It was just a very deep hole, muscle and bone at this point. In 1.5 years, her skin grew back beautifully though. What I found amazing was the body's ability to grow back separate cheeks, lol. I know that might sound odd, but from where it was, a massive hole, to 2 decent cheeks, the body never ceases to amaze me. Wound care, man. I got stories for days. Wound care. Sounds wild. Your description of that second patient with your forearm going in there and how the butt cheeks grew back, just absolutely fascinating. Incredible. Thank you for what you do. It's crazy. Wow. Young man, early 20s electrician, working on the roof of a 3-level new home build. His boss didn't supply harnessing, and he fell into a concrete pad below. Broke every bone in his face, both wrists, and one forearm. I didn't meet him until 3 days later on in the orthopedic ward, where the nurses were calling him the boy who lived. One of the Harry Potter movies had not long come out. Honestly, he should not have survived, but he did by some miracle. His young wife was equal parts terrified and furious. A lady attended ED with her throat slit. She was unfortunately a domestic abuse victim, and a vile man had cut her throat with a very large, sharp, and jagged-edged knife. Oof. The wound was so horrific and deep, it still baffles everyone how she survived. But not only did she survive, she was conscious the entire time. Thanks to the quick actions of the paramedics, they were able to protect the airway and place a tracheostomy. Unfortunately, she had been left with life-changing injuries, unable to eat and fed via PEG, and left completely unable to talk. Hi, I'm a third-year resident in internal medicine. I have a lot of examples of where patients should have died or were expected to die during the last 3 years. What stuck out for me was a patient in my first year of residency. He was a 63-year-old male who came to the emergency department because he had trouble with his breathing. He had just walked 2 kilometers to the hospital, rural. This was in peak first wave COVID time, but patient was noticed immediately because of an oxygen saturation of 64% in oximetry, which in a healthy adult should be around 94%. Most people with a value of lower than 80 are dead or in the ICU on a ventilator. I saw a patient after a few minutes and suspected COVID, for which he tested positive after a rapid test, but also diagnosed him with a massive myocardial infarction. I'm pretty sure that he would have arrested due to the arrhythmia if he had waited to come to the hospital for 1 to 2 hours. He was intubated, put on a ventilator, and had 2 new coronary stents within an hour. Took him 2 months to recover, but he survived. Not a doctor or nurse, but was there for the whole process. My husband was hit by a car going 40 miles per hour and thrown roughly 20 feet forwards. The first I knew of it was a ring at the doorbell where a chap says, "I'm with the ambulance and have your husband in the back." He'd forgotten his mobile phone and asked the ambulance to take a detour to let me know what was going on. So I jump in the back and he's a mess. Bleeding, head injury, road burns on every possible part of him, strapped down to the gurney in a neck support. When he was thrown forward, he must have rolled on every side. He had road burn on his hands, face, front, and back of arms and legs, his butt and his stomach. He was rushed into an MRI because they were concerned about the head injury. Nothing. MRI on his abdomen to check for internal bleeding. Nothing. Full body x-ray. Not a bone broken on his body. He needed stitches, but the doctor who saw him just literally said he couldn't believe he wasn't more injured. The only thing he could think of is that he must have gone like a rag doll when he was hit, and the lack of tensing saved him from more serious injury. Honestly, if you'd seen him, he looked like he shouldn't even be walking, but all his scuffs healed up, and he was absolutely fine. You know, things sometimes happen for a reason. You know, getting hit by a car at 40 miles an hour and being thrown 20 feet, that prognosis might not be very good. You just walked right out of there, so good on you. Hopefully it gives you a new perspective on the rest of life for your husband. My wife, 47 years old, in great shape, walking 7 miles a day, complained of stomach cramps. Diverticulitis had narrowed her colon, so her poop was nothing more than a thin ribbon. She didn't discuss this with her primary care physician. 2 days before Christmas, she came home and said she thought she had the flu and just wanted to sleep. When she was changing, I noticed her swollen belly. Her normal washboard stomach looked 5 months pregnant. I took her to the ER, as that isn't right. ER backed up with major holidays and possible flu gets the bottom of the triage list. The nurse kept asking, how many months pregnant? She had a full hysterectomy, so that was not possible. Explained rapid change to her belly. 14 hours pass. Finally get her x-rays. Radiologist notes full of air, ruptured colon, and she just says doesn't feel well. Fully septic. The ascending colon was removed, and an ileostomy was fitted. Sepsis shut down everything, and her heart kept pumping. She coded numerous times in recovery, one tough lady, and crazy 24 hours with her after surgery. Hospital folks would tell her she was the Christmas miracle. Still amazed, she is still with me 17 years later. For the longest time, she kept asking her surgeon, what is typical recovery time? And he deferred the question. She had an additional 7 surgeries, so we got to know her surgeon, and he finally admitted, you're the only one who survived a total septic shutdown. Nurse here. There once was a patient our floor that I think was a gunshot victim. I never directly took care of him, so I'm not sure of the story or full course of events, but the dude was basically just a torso. I guess whatever happened to him, there was so much trauma or infection or whatever that the surgeons literally amputated everything from mid-abdomen and down. He had a few surgical drains and tubes to take care of functions like urinating and defecating because the parts that do that simply weren't there. It was absolutely effing wild walking past his room when I saw him. Imagine a human being that's literally just a torso, arms, neck, and head. Place your hand on your belly and just imagine everything below that is gone. It was like some shit right out of The Walking Dead.